Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I have the enviable after-lunch position. As Jonathan said, I am Roger Gardner. I'm a member of the congregation here at Grapevine, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Back in the spring, I spoke at the Mid-Missouri study, and then later was asked to give some of the same thoughts here. Some of you were at that study, so sorry, it's a little bit of a repeat. You can blame Jonathan. I am a husband and a father and a grandfather. There is sort of a perplexing incongruence here. So why would you ask a white guy in his 60s to speak about talking to a modern audience? That's a head scratcher. Bald head scratcher at that. And by the way, looking at the audience, I recognize that we actually have a quorum of the bald committee, so we could legally have a meeting later. A little over a year ago, the College Football Playoff Selection Committee was determining the 4 teams that were going to compete. And Commissioner Greg Sankey of the SEC was on television, and he was making a strong case for Alabama, that they should be included in what at that time was the 4-team playoff, by virtue of the power of the Southeastern Conference schedule compared to lesser leagues. And to make his point, he drew upon some Sesame Street insights. He said, regarding some of the teams of the other conferences that were vying for that last spot, one of these is not like the other. This is a preacher study. I'm not a preacher. One of these is not like the others. But I appreciate your indulgence nevertheless today. A little bit of a disclaimer. I sort of doubt that my talk today is going to include a lot of stuff you don't know. But perhaps it might raise your awareness about some things that maybe we should be thinking about concerning generations, and particularly how we speak and how we conduct ourselves and how we influence people in the church and those in the mission field who we seek to reach. Nathan sort of made note of this earlier, that there is this sort of combination of art and science. And I will admit that probably most of what I'll do today is more on the art side than on the science side. In 1985, the country duo The Judds sang, "Grandpa, tell me about the good old days. Sometimes it feels like this world's gone crazy. Grandpa, take me back to yesterday, when the line between right and wrong didn't seem so hazy. Did lovers really fall in love to stay and stand by each other, come what may? Was a promise really something people kept and not just something they would say? Did families really bow their heads to pray? Did daddies really never go away? Grandpa, tell me about the good old days." The good old days. It seems so hard now. Most leaders today, I think, would argue that leadership challenges in schools, businesses, even churches, has gotten more difficult. Just ask any school teacher about that. Expectations by employees have also changed. Cultural differences seem more profound. In many ways, what leaders of organizations are facing today is really what we see on a broader scale in society at large. More stress, more anxiety, more anger, more issues, less trust, less patience, less tolerance. We seem to have a greater cultural divide today than maybe at any point. We have cancel culture, triggered emotions, and often our differences run along any number of dividing lines, whether they are ethnic or racial or political or geographical. Any number of differences and distinctions that we could identify. We hear a lot about diversity. these days. And the word diversity itself is a triggering word for some people, maybe for you. But I want to urge you to not think of it today in political terms. Because the picture that is painted of the New Testament church is one that was and should be today distinct in diversity. In that age, people who grew up thinking they should fear or even hate a particular group of people found themselves in the same house one day, worshiping together and even sacrificing for each other. And indeed, it was distinct and attractive. Jesus talked about making disciples of all nations, and the word translated nations there is ethnos. It's sort of where we get the terminology of ethnic groups in most cases. Paul wrote to the Corinthian church about diversity, and he used a metaphor of the body and its diverse parts, noting that some of those parts are different, some of them really different, but vital to the body. James challenges us to even avoid the appearance of partiality, welcoming the one with the not so clean or appealing clothes to sit up front with the rich folks. Our lips would never say, sit at the back. What about our body language? What does that say? Maybe when a young man or a young woman walks in, not dressed like what we would say is a good Christian look? Or have we considered all that God has to say about the treatment of foreigners, extending hospitality to those who are different, from a different place, with a different kind of background? And our God gently but firmly reminds us in Leviticus, you too were foreigners, and I welcomed you in. I protected you. Or in Matthew 25, Jesus says that when we welcome and serve the one who's in need, we're actually serving him. Heady stuff. Are we welcoming? I know we say the right things, and for the most part we are. So much so that we practically tackle a visitor when they come in through the door. But let's face it, we live in an increasingly diverse world, especially in the spiritual realm. And with those differences comes some challenges. To have eyes to truly see and ears to truly hear the way that we should behave and pursue that's pleasing to God. It's hard work, it's selfless work, but you know it always has been. Today I want to visit with you about some often overlooked areas of diversity, particularly age. When we examine the data regarding the differences we see in culture today, many of those differences and disagreements run along generational lines. And generational gaps have always existed. And I recognize with this image the irony of showing you something that only people of a certain age would even get. I dare say that all of us have been frustrated by older generations from time to time. If you think back, whose views on some aspects of life might be different than ours. And that's in the Lord's church, where we make respective elders and the old paths a priority. Even still, I know there are some times when I look at older generations with a sense of frustration that feels like some kind of stuckness in their lives. And then I watch a progressive commercial, and I realize that the one they're making fun of is me. So in this study, I'm also talking to myself, because I can be the old stay off my lawn guy. Speaking of grumpy old men, children now have luxury. This is a quote. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love meaningless chatter. Children are now tyrants, not servants of their household. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, tyrannize their teachers. Sound like our world today? Socrates said that 2,500 years ago. Now, there are some drastic differences today. Our little world is not so homogeneous. Gone are the days of 3 channels where everybody watched the same shows. About 95% of the shows that are on Netflix I've never even heard of before. Like many aspects of society, I would suggest that technology changes have helped to speed things up, broaden and exacerbate some of the generational differences that have always been evident in the life cycles of mankind. Social scientists agree the changes today are more extensive and they come quicker than ever before. Technology and electronic connectedness have also created subcultures, which means even more division. The term generation gap was coined in the 1960s. Favorite story, I love this. Teenager goes to his dad, and he says, "You know, Dad, it's time that I should be getting a car." Dad says, "I don't disagree. We should talk about it. But you need to know there are some things that need to change first before we even consider it. You got to demonstrate your ability to take on that responsibility. Number one, I want to see some better grades, no more C's. Number two, you need to get a job. A car is an expensive thing to operate. You need to demonstrate some financial responsibility. And number three, you need to get a haircut." A few months goes by. Son comes back. He says, "Dad, I'd like to kind of talk about that car now." He said, "You can see my grades have improved substantially. And I've got that job at the hardware store, and I'm saving some money." Dad says, "I know, I've seen all that. It's terrific." He says, "But I see that your hair is still pretty long. You haven't gotten a haircut." "Well, Dad, I looked at some of the pictures in the Bible that you gave me, and it shows Jesus with hair that's even longer than mine." Dad says, "Yeah, and he walked everywhere he went, didn't he?" My assignment is to consider how we best communicate with younger generations, specifically regarding the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'll tell you, I feel woefully inadequate to do that. I have, however, spent considerable time reading and listening and trying to learn about these different characteristics of different generations. I've had to do it in business, and of course, as I've noted, got kids and grandkids. So today, I'd like to relay some information, utilize a couple of Bible stories, and then perhaps give some insights into how we might use that and think about it as we work to teach and to guide and to lead, particularly those of younger generations. By the way, a lot of what I will say are sort of observations of this guy, and not necessarily those of management or ownership of the station. Today, I want to simply tickle your curiosity and your creative thought about how we interact and teach and guide young people in the church and young people out there who we want to reach with the greatest offer ever, the gospel. To think about how we can more effectively and intentionally capture the hearts of young people today who need assurance and encouragement as they try to navigate turbulent waters of society and career and culture and family, and as they grow in the Lord. How many have had this thought? Well, I'm glad I'm not growing up today. Or, I'm sure glad they didn't have cell phones when I was in school. Ones with cameras. Eesh. I hate to think about what may have been recorded. How do we encourage discipleship, particularly with those who seem very different in many ways? And yet they face challenges that are truly daunting, but often not so different than the ones we faced. They're just wrapped up a little differently. I mentioned diversity. I want to open your eyes to this not so obvious form of diversity, age. Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." Our Lord has given us a mission statement. And my summation is that we make and grow followers of King Jesus, so that more and more we and those we influence might be fruitful image bearers of our King. Our love of God demands that we're obedient to that directive. As John challenges us in 1 John 4:20, a professed love of God carries with it an obligation to love people. In other words, as we abide in the Lord, we have to abide with people. Biblical love requires an investment, a sacrifice. And so a consistent, sometimes frustrating biblical theme is often the depth of our love for God is evidenced in our love of people. But people, like sheep, smell. And one of the strongest odors to get over is often how different we are, one from another. It creates a huge challenge to achieve alignment in a church, a family, an organization, when people are so different. And along comes Paul, one of the early adopters of diversity. In 1 Corinthians 12, he gives a metaphor that you're well aware of. He relates the diversity in the church to body parts. He hints at the potential challenges that the church is going to face relating to some of those body parts that are different. Some of the parts of the body that seem weakest and least important are actually the most necessary. And the parts we regard as less honorable are those that we clothe with the greatest care. And boy, are there some different body parts today. Spoiler alert. Looking in the mirror, abiding in Christ is important as we think about this stuff. Likely a key component as we navigate our teaching and leadership challenges, particularly those who view life through a very different lens today. Remember, our objective is to help people become more like Jesus, not become more like me. Our objective is to become more and more like Jesus ourselves, being formed by his teaching. So it starts with us, and we are being formed every day, whether we like it or even want to believe it. Our views and our attitudes will impact how we deal with others and how we abide with other people. So, sidebar suggestion. Take a break from Fox News or CNN or whatever your flavor of news is. Take a break from the anger and the rancor and the hate on social media. It may not be helping you much. We're being formed, and therefore, our teaching and our guiding of the sheep will be impacted by what we consume. We are what we eat, and some of us are eating too much junk food. For some, it's something you might think of as like political porn. You might be addicted. Perhaps for others, angry websites, social media posts. Here's the thing, when we poison our spirit with a cloud of disdain and discouragement, we inadvertently sow seeds of fear, rather than modeling a life that is eternally hopeful. And would anyone argue that the world, especially young people today, could use a message and an example of less fear and more hope? Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. Let me share with you some information about age diversity, not something that typically gets lumped into the whole diversity discussion. Our generational differences show up in lots of areas, how we view the world, so to speak. And I'm not trying to make it more complicated. Actually, I think awareness makes it less complicated. And I think age differences, the way our generations have been formed, is worth noting. People are living longer today. Therefore, for the first time in 7 generations are alive together today. If you count the very young and then those over 95. There are some congregations you see that, right? Possibly you have 5 generations in a church, very likely 3 or 4 that need to get along. Never before have this many generations likely been together in a church or a workplace. Just a reminder of the generations that we're speaking of. The over 94, which are not listed, of course, is referred to as the greatest generation. And then there's the builder or the silent generation. That's my dad and my mom. The boomers, which I'm included, after World War II, 58 to 77 years old. Generation X or the busters, when the population trend went the other way, 40 to 58. Millennials or Gen Y, 23 to 40. Or Gen Z, they are sometimes referred today as the coronials, because of their experience with the virus. And then there's our 4-year-old Dax, who spent the first 2 years looking at people in masks, which explains maybe the fascination with Super Spider-Man. My friend Tim Elmore has spent a career studying and looking into this challenge, and he has a book called A New Kind of Diversity. I think it's really thought-provoking. And by the way, today's contestants get a free copy if you would like one. I've got a box of about 30 of them back there, and feel free to take one if you'd like. It ain't the Bible, okay? But it's got some interesting stuff in there that sort of challenge our thinking about how we deal with and how we talk with other generations and what value that actually brings us in terms of how we deal with each other and how we have influence with each other. Now, he makes a lot of really significant comparisons and actually uses some descriptive language, I think, to very interestingly show how different generations view the world differently. I'm going to give you just a snapshot of a couple of them here. So the first one of them is life paradigm. So you can see there the builder or the silent generation, be grateful you got a job. Did you ever hear that growing up? And then our group kind of came along and said, we think things can be a lot better than they have been. We're going to change a few things. Gen X, keep it real. The millennials, the dreaded millennials, right? Life is a cafeteria. And then the coronials, Gen Z, and I want to focus on this one because this one bothers me. I'm coping and hoping. That ought to take our breath away. That there is a generation out there who doesn't see hope as a viable alternative. So I want you to kind of keep this in mind because much of what I want to talk about today, even though some of it may feel or sound critical, we have a distinct opportunity in this to share something with them that they likely have never heard before. But not just share it in words, but share it one-on-one. Say another one, view of authority. This one's important. The builder generation, respect them. The boomers, replace them. Busters, or endure them. The millennials, choose them. If you're Gen Z, you got Google. Not sure I need them. You see the challenge start to develop? Sense of identity. The builder generation, I'm humble. Boomers, I'm valuable. I'm self-sufficient. I'm awesome. Gen Z, I'm fluid. The ground is moving. You can see a little picture. This is actually what was estimated for 2025. You can see sort of what the age spread looks like in most workplaces today. And, they just came out with new age discussions around Social Security, for example, with the expectation of what we've been talking about, which is people are getting older, living longer, and so the full payment of Social Security is now delayed further. So it confirms this notion that it's different. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that we need to acknowledge. From a spiritual perspective, let's take a look at some things that are happening. So these are 18 to 25-year-olds who engage in certain religious activities or beliefs. This will not be a surprise to you. You see, starting in 1972, and this ends in 2021, I would argue it's continued the trend, by and large. And this is not news, but it maybe paints a picture for one of the challenges that we have to acknowledge. There was a time back in the 80s, 90s, where most people at least had some kind of baseline understanding and appreciation and acknowledgement of the Bible, the value of church attendance, a lot of the things that we kind of think of as just ordinary day-to-day life that we would sort of build the foundation on. It's not that way today. So it's very different in terms of the baseline of the people that we will be talking to who didn't grow up in the church. Here's another one. 12th graders who attend religious services once a month. I don't know why they divided this in racially, but they did. You can see what's happened there, same thing. And not surprisingly, 2020, around the virus time, is when things even took a greater nosedive. So I show you that mostly just to give you sort of a baseline of kind of what we're talking about. Now, when we see data like this, it's important not to be judgmental and to think, well, no wonder, kids these days. And I'll admit, I'm guilty of that sometimes. And then I remember a couple of things. Older people have said the same thing about me. I'm also reminded of the time that when I met Tim, the author, and he was talking to athletic directors and coaches, and he said, look, if there's things about the next generation that you don't like, just remember, they're your kids. You did it. So what are we going to do to establish the course? And I've got to move along here. I'm reminded of what we have in Joshua 4. If you remember, it says in the future, your children are going to ask, what do these stones mean? And you can tell them the story. It's a real story, a message of courage and faithfulness. In other words, it's quite likely that many today will need to hear a lot about how much God loves them and wants the best for them. And the things that might be on our minds, worship, items on the Lord's table, have not even entered theirs. So, I think we need to be aware that to the untrained ear, teaching about correct church orthodoxy can sound less like teaching and more like just scolding. Or worse, well, we're better than the church down the road. I'm going to skip some stuff here. So, it's about time. How we invest our time. And this is an acronym. I'd like to walk through just a couple of observations and suggestions for you. First one is teaching. And I may step on my own toes as well as others on this. We've got to keep perfecting our craft. The gospel is not boring, but we can make it sound that way. Lessons that lack enthusiasm, way too long, this, do not do justice to the greatest story ever told. I'm not saying that we develop our teaching in service of itching ears. There's times to hit the hard stuff. But people today, just like people addressed in the book of Hebrews, need encouragement. They need to be emboldened to deal with a society that is changing rapidly. Need to be equipped for joyful service. And they need to see that. And friends, there's no other place that they will see it and experience like what we have to offer. Many of you are incredible scholars of the Bible. Be careful that your lessons don't go so deep in particular nuances of Scripture that we fail to tell the big story of redemption that leads to a life that is fueled by a living hope. We sometimes tend to offer information that's interesting to us, but that's about where it ends. We've got to be careful. In my lessons, I have to ask myself, is this valuable in the lives of the people who are facing a struggle? Or am I trying to show them that I know something they don't? We have to consider the realities of our time and address them, not the realities of a religious world that we find in a book of sermon outlines in 1958. There are doctrinal issues that need to be addressed and supported. There's a time and place for that. Sometimes we take on fights that nobody else is fighting, or at least nobody's fighting back. Sometimes we dive into topics assuming that people don't agree with us. As the data shows, most of the people we encounter know absolutely nothing about the Bible. I'm talking about mostly people that we were at work or at school or whatever. But there is something deep down that they do know. They know something's missing. And how do we draw that out? In Acts the 17th chapter, Paul was masterful at that as he dealt with the people of Athens. He addressed their religious interests and he complimented them, but he said, there is a God that is unknown to you. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to tell you about him. He sat in the marketplace and watched people and listened, and I think there's a lesson in that. The data shows, and I've seen this talking to and mentoring lots of young people today, they're fearful and uninformed. That's not a criticism. They need to be known and cared for, even the young people in our own pews. Consider the way Jesus taught. Simple stories with powerful messages about God's love and his extraordinary plan for our lives. Studies confirm that Jesus knew what he was doing. In fact, stories, according to research, 22 times more memorable than facts. Very few occasions where he proved a point by dissecting words. We got powerful stories to tell, and we need to read before we lead. Before we teach, we need to know the people we're talking to and understand where they are before we tell them where to go. The story of Jesus is factual. We stress that. But it's also emotional and purposeful. We can have a tendency to remove the emotion from the equation. And I get it, because we know there are churches that are all emotion. Sometimes we drive the bus too far the other way, and we can end up losing the salt. We can end up in an effort to not water it down, we don't end up watering much. And we have to be careful about that. I was raised in the Christian church, baptized at an early age. I would tell you then that I was a believer. That's about where it ended. I sort of played along, went to college, the whole church thing, kind of went out the window. Met Sherry. Things changed. Saved my life. Made my life. You don't think there's some emotion in that? We got a powerful message. In the fall of '83, meeting in Columbia. Dennis Smith was leading it. Sunday afternoon, between services, we played softball at the park. That did it. Baptized that night. I hate softball. Baseball. I'm interested in it. But I felt known and loved. Dennis sought me out, not as preacher Dennis, in my mind, but as a normal, enthusiastic guy who saw me and genuinely cared. That was 40 years ago. Connection made. I heard the gospel, but more than that, I experienced the love of the gospel. I knew very little, but I knew I was in the right place because I looked at the lives of the people who were in the right place. The world had never experienced anything like what they saw in the early church, and they turned the whole thing upside down. Intentionality. And I need to be intentional about moving this thing along because we've got to be intentional about reaching out. We tend to stay in our own little circle. Don't get me wrong, relationships in the church matter. They matter greatly. Being connected to each other is a must. Connecting with young people inside and outside the church, in my opinion, is the secret sauce. Not to prove that we're right, but to prove that we care. To spend time in an intentional way and not just in a Bible study. Sure, that should be a part of it. But connect to know them, to spend time with them, to invest, to be curious about them. I find that hospitality is an amazing tool. When people my age invite married, young people, single people over for an evening, magic happens. Often they're amazed that you would spend time with them, that you'd put forth the effort. I found that they're hungry for that kind of interest and attention, to tell their story, to hear their story and their struggles. There are always opportunities to share wisdom and insight that they either didn't get along the way or are looking for, but they're fearful and lonely today. Many of them are. And you might think, they don't want to hear from old people. Actually, they do. Dig into the studies about generational tendencies, and they'll confirm it. They just don't want to hear about how the old days were so much better. They probably already feel that, which only adds to their discouragement and lack of hope. And it can be a joyful experience for us, too. It doesn't have to be fancy. Sometimes making pizzas at the house is all it takes. Have them bring a friend or two. In the course of being intentional, by investing in them, by getting to know them, the Lord may open a door. And they'll feel the warmth of a household dedicated to God. And the joy and the stability that it provides. Never underestimate that power. And by the way, the objective should be to get to know them, not convince them of something. Jesus cared deeply about the people he encountered first, and then he taught them. And the people felt that. It'll take some courage. It'll take some intentionality on our part. Mentoring. It's kind of similar. In his book, Tim offers a terrific word picture. Guide dogs and guard dogs. Guard dogs protect and they use fear. Not the most welcoming or inviting. They don't really want a relationship with you. Guide dogs also protect, but from a selfless standpoint. They lead the blind. They lead in a sacrificial way. They relate, they look for on behalf of those they're leading, dangers and opportunities. Young people need guide dogs today. Some of us old dogs need to be better guide dogs. Young people are blind to many of the dangers, but also the opportunities that a life in Jesus can offer. And they need to be shown, not always told, about what's missing in their lives. But it takes time and patience. I think all of us can remember people who took the time to get us, to understand us, to know us. We remember that experience for maybe 40 years. Time and patience, which, by the way, is what God has offered us through Jesus. Patience and guidance. And the mentoring process, as it moves along, you might even be given the opportunity to tell what really makes your life distinctive. Enthusiasm. There's enough grumpiness and complaining in the world already. We don't need more. One of the distinctive traits that we can impress on people, especially young people who need encouragement, is that a life in Jesus is full of hope and joy. Doesn't mean you avoid addressing sin, but a repentant life is one that's full of energy and a joyful expectation of a victory. We need more of that in the world today. And we are uniquely positioned and enabled to do it. But we have to look in the mirror and take inventory of our own spirit. I have, with great regret, considered the times that I have mentored some in the past. Some of it sounded more like a burdensome to-do list rather than a helpful guide. Why would someone who's already burdened by the world be attracted to that? My yoke is easy. My burden is light. When we can exhibit living hope, it's contagious. Imagine you miss a ball game. Your favorite team's been playing, but you recorded the game. I started to say tape. But on your way home, your buddy calls you, tells you what a great win it was. I was going to watch the game. Plot spoiled. But you still want to watch the game. So you go ahead and you fire it up, and you're watching the game. Don't you watch it differently? The penalties, the drop balls, they don't get you all flustered and throwing things at the TV. Why? You know who wins. We know who wins. That ought to affect how we play the game. That hopeful expectation and confidence that the follower of Christ can have is desperately needed in the world today. It's distinctive. Hebrews 11, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. A good story, a great story, worth repeating. It's about time. I'm going to skip this part. What I'd like for you to do, here's your homework assignment. If you read through the interaction that Jesus had with the woman at the well, you'll see all of this stuff. The way he interacted, the fact that he took a side trip, it was intentional. He went to foreign territory. Talk about getting out of your comfort zone. He went to a place where he was unwelcome, not appreciated, and certainly not respected. And he talked to a woman who was in every way different from him. He was tired. He was willing to ask for help. There was an opportunity for what Tim calls reverse mentoring. The opportunity for young people to help us. Not just figure out our Apple TV, which would be good, but other stuff too, because they have a role to play. And there's a wonderful opportunity to engage them. The woman was surprised the way this guy was dealing with her. It was moving. I love this, the dramatization in the scene from The Chosen, where she says, I'm going to go to town and tell everybody about this. And he kind of chuckles and says, I was counting on it. He's counting on us to tell the story well. in a way that resonates and touches people. And I would submit to you that we need to read before we lead. Think about the conditions, the situation, the challenges, particularly of the younger people, and be wise and discerning and act accordingly the way that we deal with them and take advantage of the opportunity that's before us.